Hello, we're going to talk today about the analysis of student learning. This is where you're going to discuss your impact on student learning. What did they learn? How did they learn best? How did it impact your instructional decisions? So this is really the so what of the unit. That's our goal, is to show our impact on student learning. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the guidelines and see what we have to provide. The evidence that we need to provide, the results of analysis of student learning, has a couple of parts. The first part is that matrix. Remember, when you made your assessment plan, you needed to make sure that you had an empty rubric set up, ready to fill in with your formative and summative assessment scores. So now you have the completed matrix, and you have to make sure that you include this completed matrix in this section, so that in the following section, when you talk about your impact on student learning, whoever's reading your discussion can look back at the matrix and sort of see proof of that. So make sure that you include your matrix from your assessment plan, your gradebook. And make sure that you have a legend at the bottom. So if you use check, minus, check, plus, check, or smiley faces, or numbers, or letters, that it explains what those mean. Generally, you want to keep to the terms below standard, at standard, above standard. And that way we sort of know how students are doing. So that's the first part of this analysis of student learning, is that you collect your data. So now that you have your data, what are you going to do with it? You're going to do 4 things with your data. You're going to interpret and discuss the whole class progress. So generally speaking, you're going to look it over and say, how did we do? Generally speaking, 3/4 of the class was at standard. 2 students exceeded the standard and 2 students were below standard. This is sort of like when I hand back your drafts to you and I show sort of that rubric about how our entire class did on the draft. And we generally talk about scores. The second evidence is you're going to now get more specific, and you're going to pull out a high student, a medium student, and a low student, who are generally high, medium, and low in the class, achievement-wise. And I want you to really reflect on their progress. Look at the data in your matrix, and look at some of their work samples. You may have their journal, you may have their summative rubric. Whatever data that you have, I want you to look it over and be really specific about how they did. You might want to talk about academic achievement, 21st century skills, talk about engagement, motivation, and talk about what strategies really worked for them. You don't need to include too much student work here. Generally, the rule to go by is, if you have something extraordinary to report, for example, a student who really never does anything and is totally turned off by school, and all of a sudden you're doing forces in motion and that kid is just turned on and he is excelling at an extremely high rate, that's something you may want to include as a data source, so that we can see the impact that this kind of unit or this kind of teaching had on a student. The third evidence you want to supply is you want to sort of explain how the formative and summative assessment data provided information about student learning. So here, you're going to look across individual students, and you're going to look down individual assessments, and you're going to make some conclusions about student learning. You might talk about how Jojo began the unit not knowing very much about forces in motion, and that his pretest was very, very low. But that you could see by lesson 3, he was so engaged and so excited that he started to really exceed the standard. So that might be one way to talk about it. And then another way to talk about it might be when you look down assignment-wise or assessment-wise, and you say, well, that formative assessment we did with friction, you can see where only half the class met the standard and the other half of the class was below the standard. So that was not good, and I knew I had to go back and reteach. So you want to sort of give that kind of a discussion and be detailed about your matrix and your data that you're using. Here you might also talk about what worked best with students. You might use your anecdotal records and say, well, you know, when we did the science experiment, you can see from this assessment, students all achieved really high. But when we did a paper and pencil assessment or a multiple choice assessment, you can see how students were not so engaged. So again, sort of pull out your data and reflect on what does that mean to you about student learning. The last evidence that you're going to provide is how these assessments informed instructional decisions. Remember, one of the most important reasons why we give formative assessments is so that as teachers, we can see how students are doing and how we're doing, what's working, what's not working, and we can change our strategies before it's too late. Summative assessment is great, but if you wait until the very end of the unit, it's too late to make a change. So I want you to discuss here how your formative assessments and your summative assessments informed your instructional decisions. All of this is going to be written in paragraph form, professional language. Watch the passive voice. Make sure that you don't use any slang. And make sure that you use details when you're referring to the data. This is all about analyzing the data. So don't write any generalities about what do you think or what do you believe or what you were told. It's all about what the data shows you. So it's all about the proof. You can also use the first person here. This is a reflection on your impact on student learning. So here you can talk about yourself in the first person. Remember, when you're discussing students, you only want to use their first name, not their last name. Okay, good luck.